Hey everybody, I'm nutritionist Dr. Mike Roussel, and welcome to this edition of the Dr. Mike Show, where we're going to talk all about alcohol, unpacking, is it really good for you? Should you drink it? How much should you drink it? And what happens to your body when you do. So in today's episode, as I mentioned in the intro, we're going to talk about alcohol and is it really good for you or not? Because I think it's really interesting. Over the last several years, there's been a much larger push in the prevalence of non-alcoholic beers. There are even some non-alcoholic spirits, which is like interesting but also weird. There's some more research that's been coming out, large population epidemiologic studies that have really brought into question the idea of, is a glass of wine truly good for your heart and at what level? So I think there's a lot to unpack from an alcohol perspective, especially if you think about during times when there were a lot of restrictions around COVID. I know, anecdotally from clients and discussions I had with other people, alcohol consumption really got increased during that time. And so how does that impact our physiology? How does that impact our habits moving forward? What are the health benefits that we could really expect from alcohol? Are there particular kinds of drinks that we should focus on or not? And that's everything that we really wanted to unpack and explore in today's show. Now, the thing that I really want you to remember when it comes to alcohol is so much of this has to do with dose and frequency. So you've probably heard the phrase, like the dose is the poison, right? So like how much something is of a poison greatly has to do with the dose of it. There's this whole idea of hormesis, which is that something that would be toxic to the body given in small amounts actually creates a more robust response and can be beneficial to the body. So that's what a hormetic response is this idea of your body responding to a low dose of toxin that actually elicits a positive response. But then if you get too high of a dose of that toxin, then it becomes toxic, right? So exercise, for example, elicits a hormetic response in the body. Whereas a good dose of exercise or an appropriate dose of exercise causes your body to improve its fitness, right? So it recovers, it comes back stronger, it strengthens your heart, you can pump more blood and oxygen to your muscles. But exercise taken too far, something we call overtraining, right, actually has a negative response. And so oftentimes we just think of the dose, but we don't think of the time period. And that's also really important to consider, especially when we're talking about alcohol. But sticking with the exercise example, if you were to do exercise intensely for 20 minutes, right, there's this 20-minute dose of intense exercise. That's much different than if you did this 20 minutes once versus 20 minutes every day versus 20 minutes every other hour. Right? So the frequency of that exposure is a huge thing that we generally don't consider. We always just talk about dose, but we don't talk about that frequency of exposure and how long it goes over time. One of the things, just this week, I was writing a piece on a guide on intuitive and mindful eating. And one of the things that we were talking about in this guide was the idea of good and bad foods. And how if you truly look at what would be considered a bad food, something that is acutely bad for your body, like in that moment, there really isn't a food that fits that bill. Like what food that do you eat once in isolation is bad for you? And so again, it's not really that the dose, but with food, you think of it as the time exposure. So for example, if you ate one slice of pizza, who cares? If you ate 4 slices of pizza every day, the cumulative effects of those increased calories, that increased saturated fat, that increased sodium, that's going to have repercussions on your health over the long term. But a single exposure, hey, I'm going to have a slice of pizza, it's no big deal. And so oftentimes when we look at these foods are good, these foods are bad, there really aren't any bad foods. It just has to do more with frequency and amount over time that makes something good or not good for your health. I mean, the one real food that you can think of that's bad would be industrial trans fats. So these are fats that historically had been made through hydrogenated oils that you would find in margarines, which are pretty much been moved out of the mainstream food supply. However, you still get them in certain fried and in ultra-processed baked goods. You'll still get some of these industrial trans fats. That's really the one food, if you think, what is something that is actually bad for you in a small dose? Industrial trans fats. And, what's also interesting about that idea, trans fats, is if you'll notice the words that I'm using are industrial trans fats, because there are trans fats in dairy products. So CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, is forever been sold as a weight loss supplement. For what reason, I have no idea how it's still currently being sold for weight loss purposes. But conjugated linoleic acid, or CLA, is something that's actually, it's a trans fat at that molecular level. At the fat level, it's actually a trans fat. But it's naturally produced in dairy products. And when research studies were really unpacking the difference between naturally occurring and industrial trans fats, you really get the negative effects from these industrial trans fats. And to be honest, from the dairy products, you would have to eat a metric ton of dairy products on a daily basis to get an appreciable amount of CLA, which, even if you did, which some people get via supplementation, it's literally not doing anything for you. So, side note, CLA doesn't help with weight loss. But industrial trans fats, that would be the one thing. If we consider what's a bad food, I would say it's industrial trans fats. Kind of our little segue there on dose and frequency being the thing that's the poison. And it's perfect for alcohol because technically, I don't know if it's technically, but many scientists, you could say technically alcohol is a toxic agent for your body at certain levels. But it's also something that does have some health benefits. So let's first look at what are alcohol recommendations. Alcohol recommendations are pretty simple. 1 drink per day for women, 2 drinks per day for men. And we'll flash up on the screen if you're watching this video on YouTube, you're watching on social, what actually constitutes a drink. So we're talking about 1.5 ounces of spirits. So a shot or less than a shot, because if you're going to fill the shot glass to the top, that's actually more than 1.5 ounces. 5 ounces of wine, right, which is slightly more than just half a cup of wine. So it's usually significantly less wine than most people pour. So when you think, the one thing that's important to consider when you say, oh, I have 1 glass of wine a day, is that glass of wine actually a glass of wine, or is it more like 2 glasses of wine or 3? This is really important to consider. It's the peanut butter conundrum. When you take a scoop of peanut butter out of the jar and you think to yourself, well, that's 2 tablespoons, turns out it's 1/4 cup, right? It doesn't matter what we think the portion is. What matters is what the portion actually is to our bodies. And that's really important to consider with alcohol. Or a beer, so 12-ounce can of beer, bottle of beer, a standard beer. So a light beer would be about half. It's standardized, a serving is generally standardized on approximately 14 grams of alcohol, which is a random fact you probably will never need to recount, but in case you're wondering, it's that. And actually, that will come back in relevance when we talk about some of the health effects of alcohol consumption, because there's some cool stuff I wanted to share with you on blood pressure and also heart rate. So from an alcohol recommendation standpoint, 1 drink per day for women, 2 drinks per day for men. And this is primarily due to men can slightly metabolize alcohol better than women, and then also body size. So these alcohol recommendations come down to how fast can your body metabolize the alcohol, how fast your liver can metabolize the alcohol. The other thing to remember is the other nuance would be binge drinking. And the definition of binge drinking would be for men, 5 or more drinks, or women, 4 or more drinks in 1 sitting. And 1 sitting is generally defined as 2 hours. So whoever defined these has obviously never gone tailgating. But that's the other thing to consider. And this goes to dose and timing. So if you say, well, a drink a day is 7 drinks a week, and on Saturday I'm going to have 6 drinks, so I'm still below recommendations. It doesn't work that way. You really want to minimize, from a health perspective, how much you have at any given sitting. And so the 1 a day is really the day. Your drinks don't get to accumulate till Friday, and then you can have 5 or 6 drinks on Friday and still feel like you're within recommendations, because metabolically different things happen once you hit these thresholds that are considered binge drinking. Another piece about alcohol recommendations that is commonly touted is that wine is the preferred source of alcohol due to its antioxidant content or due to people call the French paradox, these additional health benefits. The truth is, it's just not true. Wine, specifically red wine, really over time has not been shown to have any additional benefits. Resveratrol is a specific antioxidant that is found in red wine. If you wanted to consume enough resveratrol to have an effect from red wine, you would need to enjoy a good 18 to 25 glasses of red wine in one sitting. So drinking red wine for its antioxidants and those heart health benefits really makes no sense. So you should drink, if you're going to choose to drink whatever alcohol you prefer, because red wine doesn't have those kind of magical powers that we once thought. The other thing to consider is, what are your goals? So I have always long held the recommendation for clients that if you're actively trying to lose weight, you really need to maximize or limit your alcohol consumption to about 4 drinks a week. That after we go above 4 drinks a week, there's a variety of things that happen. We'll talk about this when the other factors to consider with alcohol consumption. But I have yet to see clients consistently move towards a weight loss goal drinking more than 4 drinks a week. It is what it is. And I also think that it's not helping your weight loss. And so if that's something that you're really committed to, it's important to think about how you're thinking. Are you thinking, well, I'm going to have 5 drinks, I can get away with this extra drink and still lose weight? Or is your mindset, is this really helping me reach my goal? So 2 distinct things, right? Can I get away with this and still make progress? Or is this driving me to achieve what I want? And the mindset that I want to push you to have when you have some sort of fitness or health related goal is not thinking, can I get away with this? But more, what can I do to move this forward? And now I understand, and I totally appreciate, I joke with clients all the time, most people want to move as little as possible, eat as bad as possible, and lose as much weight as possible, right? But I don't think that that's a good place for you to be from a goal setting perspective and a mindset to attack what you're trying to do. Because if you want to gain muscle, if you want to lose weight, if you want to lower your cholesterol, if you want to lower your blood pressure, these are all very difficult things that run counter to the culture that we live in from a behavior standpoint. And so you need to tweak your mindset to be an all-out attack, not a what can I get away with. And if you can make that switch, that's really going to help drive your progress. So that's just something to think about when you're thinking about your own alcohol consumption with respects to the goals that you're trying to achieve. One of the things to think about too that I had in my notes was, can this idea of alcohol consumption in a diet making progress towards goals. So if you've listened to a variety, some of these shows and read some of the things at microcell.com, you'll know that I'm a big fan of a diet called the Mind Diet. The Mind Diet is basically this fusion of a DASH diet, which I did a lot of my graduate school work on, and a Mediterranean diet, which is one of the more popular dietary patterns. Mind Diet put these two together, and people that consistently followed the Mind Diet for 3 years experienced a 53% reduction in their risk of Alzheimer's disease. That's insane. And people who even somewhat followed the diet, so they didn't have great compliance, had moderate compliance, still had around, I believe it was 35% reduction. Somewhere say it was between 33 and 37, so let's call it 35. But still about a third percent, 33% reduction, 35% reduction in their risk of Alzheimer's disease. And this is moderately following this diet plan. One of the tenets of the Mind Diet, and one of the reasons I like it so much, is because I think it's very practical in its application, because of the instructions that they gave the people in the study, was to have a glass of wine every day. So, there's an example of a clinical diet that showed significant improvements towards cognitive disease and reducing risk of cognitive disease with having a glass of wine every day. So that's another thing to consider. Because what you're going to find at the end of this show, when we kind of go through all this data and we kind of talk through some of these key points, is alcohol consumption is super gray. I mean, it just is. And, I'm a huge fan of the gray in nutrition. We'll link up the article at microcell.com, we'll link it up in the show notes, that I wrote about the gray areas and how you need to be able to thrive in the gray. It's not good, bad, have to do this, never do that. How do you thrive in the in-betweens? How do you make your best out of lunch at a gas station because that's just what you're stuck with someday because you're on the road, right? Instead of tossing your hands up and saying, I'm going to eat Twinkies. I don't even know, do they sell Twinkies anymore? I thought Twinkies went bankrupt. But you know what I mean. Got to thrive in the gray, and alcohol is kind of in that area too. So let's talk about the benefits. I found, as I was kind of researching for the show, this great article. It was a research paper from 1985 talking about the health benefits of alcohol. And, the authors listed things like jubilant personality, lack of inhibitions, and and those kinds of descriptions, lack of stress, increased enjoyment. So kind of all the classic. I don't actually know if lack of inhibitions would be considered a benefit, depending on, I guess, where you are when you're experiencing those lack of inhibitions. But it was basically all these ideas that we generally increase relaxation, right? Those are something that people will associate with alcohol consumption, right? Is that there is this reduction in inhibitions, this increase in relaxation, de-stressing. Now I think it's actually to the point where, just like the ritual of morning coffee, maybe the ritual of an evening glass of wine or a drink, that the ritual itself signals a process of relaxation, which I am becoming more and more a believer in how these day-to-day rituals and habits frame our physiology to really drive changes and impacts in our bodies. So maybe the evening glass of wine, which you see as the relaxant, has literally nothing to do, well, not, it doesn't, because wine does, but it doesn't have as much to do with the wine itself as the relaxant as it does the process and the anticipation that you've created through this habit, right? And so that's just something else to think about. From a benefit perspective as well, we think there's increase in good cholesterol, which is your HDL cholesterol. What's interesting about this, I wrote a paper once on lifestyle changes. It was a scientific paper on, I think it was published in the Journal of Clinical Lipidology. It was a while ago now, but it was about lifestyle changes associated with increased good cholesterol levels. And one of those things that did a deep dive in was alcohol consumption. And this kind of goes back to the idea of red wine and how you have to drink wine. And it really turns out that you can drink whatever you want. Research studies have looked at wine, tequila, whiskey, beer, non-alcoholic beer, grain alcohol, like you name it. And studies have looked at those different combinations, testing different kinds of alcohol against each other. They all are basically going to increase your HDL cholesterol, your good cholesterol. And so, that's seen as a good thing, right? More good cholesterol HDL cholesterol is responsible for kind of pulling cholesterol out of our tissues. And so we need that. Men generally have it lower. Women have higher HDL cholesterol by default. But that, seems to be one of the stronger heart health benefits of alcohol consumption. From a heart health perspective, and this I think is what's the research has been coming out more recently over the last several years, is that the heart health benefits of alcohol aren't as strong as we once thought. And part of it is if you start stacking these other behaviors. So if you're exercising on a regular basis, if you're eating a healthy diet, if you're getting adequate sleep, if you're doing these things, you're not really going to get that much more of a benefit from your glass of wine or your cocktail each day. So the healthier you are, and I think this is actually probably the case with lots of things, that the more you stack healthy behaviors, the less one specific behavior becomes as important. So if you're exercising, eating, and sleeping, having that glass of wine probably doesn't make that much of a difference. Whereas if you were maybe eating right, and then you were also having a glass of wine, but you weren't, or I got to stop using wine as an example because you're going to start thinking that like wine is a thing. Like you have a Manhattan, but you're not exercising and you're not getting as much sleep. The benefit that the benefit that the Manhattan is going to convey on your health is going to be proportionally greater. So oftentimes if you're thinking, how do I optimize my overall health? starting with exercise, nutrition, and sleep. Those are really the pillars. And if you do that, that's really where you're going to get a bulk of your health boost. There may be a potential improvement in a reduction in risk of diabetes. But again, I really think this has to do with the individual, other lifestyle habits, and also the dose, because alcohol can have these, kind of weird effects on carbohydrate metabolism. So if you have issues with carbohydrate metabolism, like a pre-diabetes, and then you're also consuming alcohol at a more moderate or more than moderate level, that's going to further exacerbate those carbohydrate metabolism issues. And so it's really not going to help. But at a population level, people who moderately consume alcohol on a regular basis do have a lower risk of diabetes. So from a benefit perspective, that's really what we're looking at. Improvements in HDL cholesterol, increases in relaxation, reductions in stress, potential reductions in risk of diabetes, modest improvements in heart health, but those are quickly outweighed by kind of core behavior patterns. So if you're justifying your daily gin and tonic in that it's improving your overall health while you're doing all these other things, it's not probably the case, but if you want to have the gin and tonic, just enjoy it. Which actually, one of the things that brings me back to recommendations, which I forgot to mention, all the recommendations, and I think this is super interesting about alcohol recommendations, all the recommendations across the board basically say, if you don't currently drink, don't start drinking to get these benefits, right? So if you're abstaining from alcohol, you should continue to abstain from alcohol. If you choose to drink alcohol, then drink it moderately, 2 drinks a day for men, 1 drink a day for women. That's how the recommendations are worded, which I think is interesting, and then kind of makes you wonder, well, what is the benefit here? And so again, it gives you a little bit more of this gray. So as we talk about some of these benefits, know that none of them should move you to drink if you currently aren't someone that consumes alcohol. I hope that makes sense. All right, so now let's get into some of the drawbacks. So drawbacks, I kind of look at them as the big 3. There's heart drawbacks, which is interesting because we've always talked about alcohol from a heart health perspective. There's cancer, and then there's also sleep. So if we look at the heart health, and I have some notes here because I want to get this right. If you look at 1 to 2 drinks, having 1 to 2 drinks, so moderate consumption, low to moderate consumption, what you consistently get acutely, so in that short term, is you get an increase in your heart rate, kind of like a 5 beats per minute boost in heart rate with alcohol consumption, and that can persist up to 24 hours. You get no changes in blood pressure, though. Generally, changes in blood pressure, non-existent, until you get up to that more than 2. So research, when it looks at grams of alcohol, and this is kind of where it gets weird, greater than 30 grams of alcohol, and I've also heard it talked about as 3 or more drinks, but 30 grams of alcohol is technically 2 drinks. So think more than 2 drinks in one sitting. Not only do you get the increase in your heart rate, but you also get an increase in blood pressure that starts around 13 hours after consuming the alcohol, right? So think about this. You have a couple drinks at night, your heart rate is elevated, you go to sleep, you wake up, your blood pressure is 5 points higher, right? 3.8 points higher. And so there's this really interesting time effect, and then that'll persist for about 24 hours. It might persist longer, but usually they kind of stop monitoring people after about a day with these shorter term studies. So there's these weird effects with alcohol consumption in your heart. Basically, any consumption of alcohol is going to increase your heart rate. If you get north of 30 grams of alcohol in kind of one sitting, then we're looking at greater than 2 drinks. At about 13 hours, you're going to get this increase in your blood pressure. So for people who do have high blood pressure, this is something to think about, because you've probably heard, have a glass of wine, it's good for your heart. But it's not actually that good for your heart if you have high blood pressure, because after 13 or so hours, you're going to get this increase in blood pressure, which runs counter to hopefully everything you're doing from a nutrition and fitness perspective. So if you do have high blood pressure, you should really consider not having more than 2 drinks in one sitting. That would be the best thing for your heart. Next is cancer. So cancer risk is interesting because I feel like a lot of how cancer risk is portrayed especially in mainstream media, is full of fear tactics around consumption of foods. That, oh, you don't eat this food because it increases your risk of cancer. You don't, sitting is the new smoking, like that sort of stuff. I was actually doing a piece about sitting is the new smoking. I was writing about that topic yesterday, right? It just sounds ridiculous. Like, sitting is not the same as smoking cigarettes. With alcohol consumption and cancer risk, basically anywhere that alcohol is going to touch, so you can think about it this way: mouth, throat, esophagus, stomach, cancers, colon cancer, you can get a moderate increased risk in these cancers. Now, one of the ones, and I saw this in probably 5 or 6 different mainstream health articles when I was doing a little digging for today's show, was talking about how you even have an increase in risk of cancer with just consumption of a little bit of alcohol. And I was thinking, man, what does that even mean? So if you really dig into the data, it's more fear-mongering than anything. So this is looking at people who don't drink versus people who had to have 1 drink or less kind of per week, right? So very low alcohol consumption. And the increased risk, and again, the context of this. So imagine you're sitting down and you're filling out a survey. If you're from my generation, number 2 pencil, right? Filling in little holes, right? Multiple choice, Scantron style. I don't think they do that anymore. But if you're, filling that out, reflecting on your nutrition habits for the last year, right? You get this survey in the mail every 2 to 4 years, and you fill out all these little holes, multiple choice, asking about your nutrition habits over the last year. It's not the world's most accurate way of getting nutrition data, but if you do it for 20,000 people, the idea is that the large number of people, that makes up for the lack of precision of the measurement instrument. But it's important to just put yourself in the shoes of that person filling this out. So it's someone who's basically saying they don't consume alcohol very much. And the increased risk, and this is specifically around breast cancer, is 1.04. So this increased relative risk, 1 is basically no risk. So we're looking at a 4% increase in risk of breast cancer in people who will occasionally have alcohol consumption, occasionally consume alcohol. 0.04 or 4% could almost be considered a rounding error. Like, there's probably 10 things that you do in your life on a daily basis without even thinking about it, right? That cumulatively are going to have that sort of effect. And so I think it's just, I don't know, I really don't like this part of health journalism and reporting where they're saying even having any alcohol is going to increase your risk of breast cancer. I mean, come on. Like, that 4% increase is very small, and it's more of it's not more of, it is an association. It's not causality. And so I definitely don't want you to think, I don't drink very often, maybe once or twice a month, and now you're scared because it's going to increase your risk of breast cancer. The data doesn't really support you having that level of concern, because we're talking about a 4% increase in relative risk, which is very, very small. If this were to be flipped and we were to be talking about bacon consumption and it was a 4% elevated risk, the whole low carb, paleo, ketogenic crew would just talk about how, that research is ridiculous and it's only 4%, it's associations. So I think it really depends, what side of the looking glass you're looking through. And I wouldn't be that concerned about consuming alcohol on an infrequent basis and then having that increased risk in breast cancer, especially if you're doing all these other things correctly. The other thing, I want to note, mouth, throat, and liver cancers, those have stronger associations with greater consumption. So greater than moderate consumption of alcohol. So you need to, drink more than recommendations to increase risk in those areas specifically. The last thing on sleep. So sleep is really interesting because I feel like for the longest time, we never really talked about the negative effects of sleep that you experience when you consume alcohol. And part of it because alcohol is like almost like a double-edged sword, and it has these 2 opposing effects when it comes to sleep. So because alcohol is a sedative, it's actually going to help you fall asleep faster. So the time in which it takes for you to fall asleep is called sleep latency, or it's often called like sleep time to sleep onset. And if you have a drink, that's going to help make that time shorter. So you're going to fall asleep faster. But then what happens is, as part of your sleep cycle, so your body goes through these distinct stages of sleep, deep sleep and REM sleep, and it takes about 90 minutes. And so it goes through these 90-minute cycles as long as you're asleep. In the first 2 sleep cycles, after you consume alcohol, you get reductions in REM sleep. And REM sleep is really, all sleep is important, but REM sleep is really important. And as you get older, you actually proportionally get less and less REM sleep. And part of it is that as people get older, yes, they sleep less by default, right? You just naturally sleep less. But it's the decrease in REM sleep that really causes the problems that people identify, the sleep problems that people identify with as they get older. So REM sleep is really kind of the magic sleep for us from a memory and cognition perspective. And when we consume alcohol, those first 2 sleep cycles, REM sleep is significantly decreased. So then you're thinking, okay, well, how much do I need to drink to have this effect? And what's wild is if you were to drink recommendations, 1 drink for women, 2 drink for men, you get about a 25% decrease in sleep quality that night. So even if you're following along with recommendations, it's still negatively going to impact your sleep. The Sleep Foundation recommends that you don't consume alcohol within 4 hours of sleep to minimize those effects. And I would say to that time probably needs to be expanded depending on how much you're consuming. That the longer you can get away with, the further that distance between alcohol consumption and sleep, the greater that can be, the less it's going to impact your sleep. So that's also something to consider. And even though alcohol is going to help you fall asleep faster, the net on your sleep is bad. And so if you're not getting a lot of sleep from a time perspective, seriously consider not having a drink that night, because it's just going to make that short amount of sleep even worse by decreasing your REM sleep. So that's a really important, I think, underappreciated part of alcohol's impact on our physiology. So last piece for us to talk about here is things to consider. So 3 things that you should consider that aren't direct impacts on alcohol and our physiology, but do impact our progress towards our goals. So these things are calories, metabolic repercussions, and our behaviors. So alcohol is not calorie free. And if you're going to have a drink, it could be, if you're just drinking tequila on the rocks, right? It's not going to be that many calories. Alcohol is 7 calories per gram. So it's somewhere between protein and carbs and fat. So 4 calories per gram protein and carbs, 9 calories per gram fat. Alcohol is a little bit in the middle. So you got 7 calories per gram. So there is this, there are calories to it. But usually, too, there's going to be calories with whatever you're going to mix it in. So if you have beer, there are carbohydrates. If you have wine, there are carbohydrates. If you have a mixed drink, there could be a lot of carbohydrates, because generally spirits are mixed with some sugary mixer to sweet and balance out kind of that bitterness and that bite from the alcohol. So you really need to think, what else am I consuming when I have a drink, and how is that impacting how many calories I'm trying to take in? Like if you are, really trying to minimize added sugars, and then you have 6 drinks over the course of a weekend that all have added sugars, vodka tonic, for example, right? Tonic has sugar in it. And so you're going to stack up all these added sugars, and you're like, man, where's all this coming from? And it's coming from the drink. So we really need to consider that. The other thing to consider is, like I said, the metabolism. So chronic alcohol consumption, can lead to fatty liver, right? Just the way that alcohol is metabolized in your liver. It depletes glutathione, which is the primary antioxidant in your liver. N-acetylcysteine is a dietary supplement that was actually pulled off the market from the FDA due to kind of a definition of is and what, some legal mumbo jumbo back and forth, but it's currently back on the market. N-acetylcysteine does a really good job of replenishing glutathione stores in your liver, because it's actually very similar in structure. So on a day when you do consume more alcohol, having some supplementing with N-acetylcysteine before you go to bed or when you wake up, I think is a prudent approach to help support liver metabolism and overall liver health. But there aren't really any other supplements. Like if you look at stuff that's marketed towards supporting liver health and alcohol metabolism, like milk thistle extract, none of that stuff really works. I really think N-acetylcysteine is kind of the only one that can directly support liver metabolism and health. But you got to think about that too, in that alcohol also has impacts on carbohydrate and fat metabolism. And so if you're going to be consuming a bunch of alcohol and eating a bunch of carbs and more foods, which as generally sometimes we do, which we'll talk about in a second, what are the metabolic repercussions of those things? So alcohol consumption doesn't really set you up metabolically to win the day. And the last piece is behaviors. For a long time, one of the core things I even talked about with clients was that it's less about the drinks, but then it could be like, well, what are all the behaviors? What are all the things that you're doing after you have a couple drinks and those caloric repercussions? And so I have drinks and I really only eat pizza after I have drinks, right? Because you have a couple, you're relaxed. Per that 1985 research paper, your inhibitions are a little lowered and you're making bad food choices, right? Or poor food choices than you otherwise normally would. So that's the other thing to consider is after I have a couple drinks, what are my food choices and what are some of those behaviors? Am I staying up later so I'm not getting enough sleep, but I'm also getting the reduction in sleep quality? So calories, metabolism, and then behaviors, I think, are three things that people generally don't think about when they think about the role of alcohol in their diet and then their day-to-day life. And so those are three other things that I think are really important to consider when it comes to finding that role of alcohol in your diet and optimizing your overall health. So that's kind of going to wrap it up for our discussion on alcohol. Is it good? Is it not good? Does it fit in your diet? Does it not? What you're going to see is, hopefully, I didn't tell you to drink or not drink either way. Recommendations do say if you don't currently drink, don't start for health benefits, right? That's one. But I really wanted to just lay out for you today the story and what we know about alcohol consumption, the good and the bad, and the things that we don't think about from a health perspective, so you can then make that decision to see how it fits in your life. I truly don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. We'll link up that story about thriving in the gray zone and how that's really key for nutrition. But this is a decision, hopefully now that you have more information, you can figure out the best way that it fits into your life and that you're also not going to get sucked in by these weird health articles telling you that a glass of red wine is the panacea of heart health, or that if you have, one gin and tonic every other month, that it's going to cause you to get breast cancer. That stuff both of them are ridiculous, both ends of the spectrum, and they're both ridiculous. So, thanks so much for tuning into today's show. As always here, we got today's show brought to you by Synthesis, Substance Nutrition, the protein powder that I formulated. It's an incredible mix of whey protein isolate and micellar casein to give you those high quality amino acids that your body needs to build and repair muscle, but also to help slow and prevent muscle breakdown. It's delicious, helped formulated. A friend of mine, certified master chef Ken Arnone, helped me formulate the product. The label is super refined and clean, not busy. Your 6-year-old could probably pronounce all the ingredients as long as they can say xanthan gum on the back. And you can go to substancenutrition.com to check it out. If you haven't tried it, you're going to love it. It just, authentic vanilla truly describes the flavor. So again, that's substancenutrition.com. Thank everybody for tuning in. If you haven't already, like and subscribe to the show on iTunes. That really helps. And share with a friend. I'll see you guys next week.